I'm Jake Lewis, and welcome to the Behavioural Deep Dive. Today, I'm excited to be joined by my colleague and co-lead at SEB Collective, Dr. Adam Feinberg. Adam is a psychologist and educational consultant who works with schools and systems to strengthen student wellbeing, behaviour, and academic outcomes through a multi-tiered system of support. He brings a depth of experience to this space, both here in Australia and internationally. Before moving to Australia in 2024, Adam was the director of the Northeast PBIS network in the United States and has also held faculty positions at the University of Connecticut and the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Since relocating to Australia, he's been an invited speaker at national and international events and has been working closely with schools across New South Wales. Adam is also the co-chair of the Association of Positive Behaviour Support Australia, where he contributes to advancing PBIS and MTSS work across the Australian educational landscape. And I want to give a little shout out to the APBSA Association. It's a great association to be a part of. You have a Facebook page that is up and running at the moment. So if anyone is interested in having a look or gaining some further information about that association, that's probably the best go-to place for it, Adam.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for promoting that.
Adam completed his PhD in school psychology through Lay University, and he's also a doctoral level board certified behavior analyst. So he sits right at that intersection of psychology, education, and behavior science. He brings a calm, grounded perspective to very complex work, and that's something that I've always admired about Adam as we've started SEB Collective and continued through the journey of working with schools through SEB Collective. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, and I'm excited to welcome Dr. Adam Feinberg onto the podcast.
Thank you, Jake. That's very kind. I'm excited to be here, and I look forward to our discussion today. So thank you.
Well, let's get into it. So our listeners can learn a little bit more about yourself. How did you come to work with schools and districts around implementing multi-tiered systems of support?
So as you said, and through my university work, I'm a school psychologist. I got my PhD in school psychology, and I graduated in early 2000s, not to date myself a little bit, but I found that during that time, school psychology was really thinking about what's the future of school psych. And a lot of the conversations was really about prevention and how we really minimize or reduce the risk of students having mental health issues, behavioral, social, emotional challenges versus just kind of more of those responding for our kind of more reactive strategies. How do we minimize the rates, prevalences, and how do we set up and design our schools to be organized in such a way that they reduce the likelihood of social, emotional, behavioral problems overall? So within that mindset, I was really intrigued about the different types of practices around multi-tiered systems of support, around primary systems of prevention. What do we give to all students to really help support in their social, emotional, behavioral growth, their mental health capacity to really be resilient? And then how do we respond in different tiers? How to be efficient in our resources for students who need a little bit more? So I was really intrigued about that. And so I went along and furthered my studies and did internships with really amazing and wonderful people that were doing this kind of work. And I really tried to learn as much as I can. So yeah, I've been very lucky to have the experiences I had and excited to be here in Australia to share it.
And we're super excited to have you here and very fortunate to have you here as well. And what does your work look like now? So if a school principal or a teacher was listening to this, what does your work look like on the day-to-day?
Yeah, well, I get the honor of working with you. And with that work, it's really great to be able to support schools and kind of regions or collectives in various jurisdictions around tiered models of support, how to help schools really think about the larger preventative strategies that they can put in place, whether it's school-wide or at the classroom level, really supporting social emotional behavior, thinking about classroom supports as well, looking across that tier as helping schools understand what strategies they currently have in place and where they could have room to grow around prevention services in schools, thinking about service supports at tier, not only tier 1, but tier 2, and what that might look like to build tier two strategies to help reduce the incidences or the intensity of social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. And also thinking about how we respond to our students that need more intensive or like individualized supports at that tier three level. And you're doing training around those types of more intensive supports, such as thinking about functional behavioral assessments into behavioral support plans and really helping schools build their own capacity to design those. And then in addition to that, I get to sometimes work with universities like Monash and do various projects with them around tiered models of support, much more of a behavioral psych approach to prevention as well as student support in schools. So yeah, it's been wonderful.
And speaking of supporting students' social, emotional, behavioral growth, especially, and also talking about classroom strategies, today we are going to be focusing on positive classroom practices. Positive classroom practices is something that we tend to speak about more generally within professional learning, but today we wanted to sort of deep dive in, particularly on a few of those strategies or high leverage strategies within the classroom. But starting more broadly, before we dive into a couple of selected strategies, what are positive classroom practices and how do they look within the classroom?
So positive classroom practices are those practices that really set students up for success within a classroom. Let's just think about it a little bit more broadly initially. Students spend majority of the time in their school day within classrooms. So when we think about that, we want to make sure that students are benefiting from that amazing, really strong instruction that our teachers are providing. If we if that's the goal, we need to make sure that students can be really in a place, sitting in their seats, attending and ready to learn and engaging and participating. That is not something that we just can assume and expect that all students are going to come in and just do naturally. We want to make sure that we are setting up that classroom in a way that students really know what to expect. They feel safe and supported, and they know what it means to be a good student and access that learning so they can be successful in with the instruction that the teacher provides. So I liken it to like there's kind of two pieces to be a really strong teacher. One is to have really good quality explicit instruction processes going on, but also is having good positive classroom practices so the students can really benefit from that instruction.
And when we look at positive classroom practices, there could be a number of different strategies that teachers utilize within their classroom day to day to support the social, emotional, behavioral growth, as well as the academic growth of their students within the classroom. Are there a core number of positive classroom practices that you teach to? And if so, what are they?
So there are a number of really recommended and evidence kind of based or informed classroom practices. Two resources that I think are good for folks to have, and luckily they're free. One is called Supporting and Responding to Students' Social, Emotional, Behavioral Needs, and that's brought out by the National Center of Positive Behavioral Intervention Supports out in the US. It's a great free resource that really outlines what the strategies are and has a lot of good detail that if you're a school and you want to organize some professional learning for your staff, it's a great resource to use. It is available for free, and I know it's a US document. There is Victoria Department of Ed has put out a really wonderful document that obviously takes these and contextualizes them for us, the Australian context. And so that's their positive classroom management strategies, or PCMS. So if you Google Victoria PCMS or Department of Ed PCMS, I'm sure that that'll come up, and hopefully, Jake, you can link them in the show notes. But they outline a number of really strong practices that from really having good, clear classroom expectations, making sure we're explicitly teaching those expectations to our students, practicing prompting them through really good active supervision strategies, outlining them and making them clear for our different routines, what it looks like to be a good student at various times that might be a little bit different from our, like the setting up and getting started with a lesson to independent seat work to finishing activities and packing up and getting ready to go. Like all these different routines are really important to make sure that they're clearly defined. And then making sure that students are actively engaged through opportunities to respond and have really strong response strategies, whether they are positive in providing behavioral specific feedback to error corrections when students make behavioral errors or academic errors. So a number of these strategies, and they're outlined in those documents. And I know that teachers are doing these strategies every day, but having a really good understanding of how to use these strategies well and which ones to emphasize at different times is really the kind of where that science of teaching comes into the art of teaching and finding that balance. So yeah. So I think those are a broader view of those strategies that are important.
That's great. And you've listed a number of really great strategies there. Not all classroom practices, I suppose, are created the same in terms of having the same amount of impact on supporting students' social, emotional, behavioral, and academic growth. If there were sort of a top 2 to 3 high leverage practices that you would wave your magic wand and have in place within a classroom, what are those 2 to 3 practices?
Yeah, there's been some research by Mel Collier-Meek and colleagues that have really looked at the relative kind of statistical weight or power. And again, this is beyond the realms of this discussion probably, but they looked at like various strategies and tried to identify which ones are much more predictive within the literature. And what they found was that having like clear routines and explicitly defining kind of what's expected in those routines, as well as clear behavioral specific feedback, really rose to the top. And I hesitate, and I think we need to put that in context. Like, I think it's important to make sure that we are understanding a lot of the other classroom expectations that I spoke about. I think they're all very important. This probably gives you a guide of kind of areas to start, because I do think it's important to really work on all of them. But as we're looking to build and support teachers and educators, if we want to firm up a few initially as we get started, these might be where you might start. So that's kind of really nice and have that guidance. Some of the other strategies I think are really important, but it's maybe harder to research, like positive relationships and understanding the impact of something like having good, really supportive relationships between teachers and students really feeling safe within the classroom. I think that could be a really nice strategy to work on as well. However, if I would get started and I had to like identify one, it's always good to use the school's data and really check in with this teaching staff at all times. But yeah, maybe you start with the expectations around the routines and as well as behavioral specific feedback.
So number 1 would be expectations. And then number 2, where you're leaning towards routines and procedures. And then number 3, behavior specific feedback.
Yeah, I think those are really good, solid places to start. I think with the number of strategies that are listed, I think that the positive classroom management strategies in Victoria, they have like 8 or 9. If I was gonna really work with a school, or if I'm in a leadership team, try to kind of enhance the classroom management strategies of my teachers and really kind of wanting to support them, you can't do them all at once, or spreading itself too thin. It's probably harder to really ensure that teachers are mastering it, really understanding and using it, and be able to really build up that skill and use it really, really well, and understanding when to like really maximize it and when they can focus on some other parts of the instructional process. Teaching is not an easy profession. It's a very challenging profession. So we can't be masters of everything at all times. So with that, thinking about focusing on a few things, I think is helpful. So yeah, really thinking about those expectations, really defining them across the routines in the classroom. And then when students are presenting them and demonstrating them and doing really well, that's when it's really nice to provide some behavioral specific feedback and being clear on that. So yeah.
Do you mind if we jump into those 3 strategies or practices a little bit more deeply?
Of course. Of course.
Perfect. If we start with the classroom expectations, because I know there are a couple of phrases when we're talking about classroom expectations that can be used a little bit interchangeably. We have values and expectations, as well as expectations and rules. Would you be able to sort of establish a shared understanding of that language as we move forward with this particular practice?
Yeah. And I think that, yeah. So it's, what's important is that we want the staff across the building to have consistent language. We want everybody to ensure that we're using similar language. So when students are moving from classroom to classroom or we're moving across the school, they hear the same types of language around what's expected of them. So therefore, that consistency really builds that mastery on the student's part. So having shared understanding of what those values are, and that's what you'll see a lot in schools, the recommendation across Australia and different jurisdictions is around having a broad set of values or principles, such as some schools will use like be respectful or we are responsible or we are safe. That's that broad language that really allows us to identify some initial expectations of what we value there at the school. And then because that really helps us to kind of hone in on a few set of social emotional behavioral domains that we're focusing on, right? It's kind of like our social skills curriculum that's really contextualized for the school. But then we need to kind of go further and define what that is, because what it looks like to demonstrate a broad value such as respect may look different in different settings or different routines of the school day. So that's when we have more explicit or clear expectations that are clearly defined for that particular setting or routine. So such as respectful, I'm thinking about how loud you are or how quiet you are is going to vary across the school day. If we're out in the recess area, we could be louder. If we're in the canteen, we could be louder. But if we're during a teacher directed lesson and we're doing a science class, we need to be quieter and we need to have the voice volume to be probably 0 or the voice volume to be low, that and have a way of getting the teacher's attention if we need to participate or share. So having those expectations set, making sure it's clearly defined what the behaviors are for, I'm just using the examples of respect, responsible, and safe because they're pretty common. Well, what does it mean to be safe during a science lesson versus a literacy lesson, or when we're at the arrival time or out on recess? It's going to shift a little bit. So we want to be explicit. We want to be clear. We want to make sure that we are teaching those on a routinely basis to make sure our students know them and that majority of students are actually demonstrating them. So yeah, hopefully that was clear.
Yeah, the consistency in language that you've just spoken about is so important. Just so students have consistent expectations from setting to setting, but also establishing between educators what respect looks like. I know what respect looks like to me can be very different to what respect looks like to you. So having that shared understanding and that common language around what respect and responsible, safe, those sort of core values look like within different settings is helpful for the students, but it's also extremely helpful for the educators within the building as well.
Yeah, we don't want, I liken it to like having multiple parents. It's like if the two parents have very wildly different expectations, like it's going to be harder for that student to follow, and then they might kind of work one off the other kind of thing. The more that we could be consistent, but not that every teacher has to be 100% consistent across the school, but the more that we could all share similar language and have similar levels of expectations, I think like cell phone use is a good example of this. The more that the students will follow it, they know what to expect. They're not like being confused and end up like trying to take advantage of a situation. It's just more of students are really clear what the expectations are and they are coming in and it's consistent. It's a standard routine. Nothing's going to be a little bit of a surprise. And I think that routine and that predictability really creates safe environments for students.
And educators as well. The hats on the playground is a perfect example of it. If it's consistent and students need to wear hats on the playground, then it's constantly being reinforced and corrected, then that's the expectation. However, if it's an expectation that's inconsistently applied, if some students walking around with educators and their hats are off or they're not wearing hats, and then The educator comes out in the next duty, corrects the same students, and it becomes a Mr. Feinberg mustn't like me, so he's telling me to go into the collar, rather than that's the expectation of the school. So that consistency and predictability in language and application of the expectations is so important.
Great
You spoke
example.
of,
Yeah.
you spoke briefly about making sure that those expectations are taught. What does that teaching look like initially, as well as what does that teaching look like ongoing within classrooms to make sure that those expectations are consistently applied and prompted within the classroom and playground settings?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's as it's important to have them, the expectations, but teaching them is the is probably like it's probably equally or if not more important. I mean, you really can't do one without the other, I guess. But really kind of teaching it is what we really want to focus on because that's how students learn, right? And what's amazing is that schools are designed for teaching. So teachers really know how to teach well. So how we would teach a lesson, whether it is a literacy, math, science, those are the same kind of strategies we do with teaching those academic skills. We want to apply to the social emotional behavior skills as well. So that includes defining it explicitly, being very clear. And then in addition to that, making sure that you are actively teaching. So that's explicitly like through demonstration or modeling of the skill, allowing the students to practice and provide feedback on their practicing of that skill. And then thinking about how those expectations throughout the day, how we're going to provide feedback when the students get an opportunity to really, in the situation, in that context, demonstrate that. And as we're initially teaching this, we may spend a little bit more time providing that feedback or providing some prompts in that setting. So thinking about those different components, such as explicitly demonstrating and modeling, providing practice opportunities, prompting in the setting, and providing feedback in the setting, those are the things we want to see. So what that could look like is that at the beginning of the year, or maybe at the beginning of our term, we do some more intensive instruction that may take about 15 to 30 minutes just to review an expectation or some of the expectations or a set of expectations. And then throughout the year, we hopefully do a little bit more of kind of micro teaching, some brief reviews, maybe at the beginning of the day or beginning of an activity. And we kind of just do some quick prompts, some quick reminders. And then throughout the day, we're reinforcing through behavioral specific feedback. So those are the different pieces that when you and I go into classrooms that we want to see and hear. So it's not just a set of expectations that have been promoted on a website or on a wall, that it really comes to life and is part of the routines, the language of that school. So, yeah.
What could, just to bring life to one of those examples that you provided, what could prompting or pre-correction look like prior to the students engaging in activity? What are some of the things we look to see or hear within the classroom around using the language of those expectations?
Yeah, think about it as if we're looking at getting started and getting ready to learn and sitting down and starting work. A lot of times we're moving from highly active environments such as just the arrival of the day and just getting in and getting started with a lesson or coming back from lunch in the canteen and like coming back in and getting started with a lesson. That transition can be tough for schools. It's tough for us coming from a little more active social environment to something that's a little bit more a quieter, much more passive and like listening and learning or doing like maybe an academic task. That's not an easy transition. So with that, you might want to make sure that that transition is taught. Maybe there's like a do now activity so that you might want to make clear initially what you expect as that transition occurs. Hopefully it's been taught at the beginning of the term or at the beginning of the year, and that students really are familiar with the set of expectations for getting started with an academic task, and that they know what's expected of them and what it means to be, let's just use the values of respect, responsibility, and safe. They know what it means to be that. So therefore, you're just reminding. You may like prompt some students to ask like, Jake, can you tell me what it is to be respectful as we get started with our work? Or you might kind of just do a quick review, hopefully quick 30 seconds, And then that hopefully can recenter the students on what you expect of them. They hear from other students that, but they're communicating what's expected of them. And then you can hopefully walk around, supervise, and provide some behavioral specific feedback for those that aren't doing it. And so that behavioral specific praise can really be helpful to not only draw attention to what you want to see and to those students that are doing it, and also reinforces the students that are doing it as well.
Yeah, well, those strategies and practices work hand in hand in like a cycle of setting up and then reinforcement of particular behaviors. But I like that micro teaching component that you mentioned, that quick 30 seconds around, hey, as we come into the classroom, responsible looks like X, Y, and Z, to use those language of the values and expectations within instruction. And so it's very quick and prompting those expectations prior to students that needing to engage in those particular behaviors.
And I think that's the important thing is like it's not always a big lesson that we are providing like we would at the beginning of the school year to really kind of make sure all students know what to expect. We all need some brief reminders, especially when we're might have been out on the recess or we're coming in from lunch. Those types of things, like just the quick reminders of what we expect, what we're moving into, how we want to get through this lesson, what's expected of the teacher, what's expected of the students. Quick reminders. It doesn't have to be, especially if the routines that our students are doing every day. Listen and watch what the students are doing. If they are coming in, following the expectations and really doing it, you might do a lot of the prompts at the beginning of the day only. But if there's those trouble spots, where you have a good percentage of the students that are not following what you expect them to do, that's when you might need to do a reset and spend a more routine minute, 30 seconds to a minute at the beginning of each activity, just to make sure that students are understanding and they know what to expect. And then use your reinforcement at the end to when after that they start demonstrating it, just to build that cycle of a positive support around that students, around the classroom actually.
One of the core challenges in implementing this particular practice is one that you've touched on already, is when there's an inconsistency in expectations, it can be really difficult to teach and reinforce those expectations. One of the core challenges that schools can face is when there's inconsistency in expectations across different settings, particularly settings that are outside of the school's control, like the home setting or the community setting. What can schools do if there are differences or incompatibilities in the expectations that are taught in another setting compared to the school setting? And can you just talk through an example of where that might occur? Sorry,
Yeah, it could
that's a
be.
loaded question, that one.
Yeah, yeah, it sure is. And honestly, schools are facing this every day, and just like there's differences in the expectations on what we expect of students and staff when they arrive in the building, and that the first few minutes on arrival versus a setting like a maths lesson. There's different expected behavior on us and our students, our homes, the community. There's different expected behavior to the school. And we can't really control that, but we have to recognize, and it's best for us just to learn what those differences are so we can really do what's best for the school environment. So just like the school can't control what happens at home, we can understand what happens at home and make sure that there's probably reasons why the home environment is set up that way. There's cultural norms, there's different values, and that's understandable and to be expected. And I think we all grew up in homes that may have some aspects were different around values and norms or behavior. How we're supposed to hold ourselves was different than at the school. So I think we can all identify with that concept. I think where the school can do is ensure that helping all the students that enter into that school and are part of the school community understand that what happens, what we expect at that school to be an understandable, like a way that's predictable, it's safe, it's rational for that school community. So hopefully that those sets of values and expectations are something that the whole school community is part of. So it really is not something that just leadership comes together and identifies, but it's something that the teachers, the students, and our families have a voice in and can really come up with, here at school, what do we expect? So once that has been set and defined, that the whole school community feels like they have a voice in, then it's a matter of saying, here at school, this is what we have agreed upon that we promote and that we practice and that we acknowledge and recognize. So it's important that schools are safe and supportive environments. And with that, it's nice that it's also predictable. That predictability, that safe, knowing that adults are there looking after you, make sure that those schools are just really places that students want to be. And students know that they can go to when things might be chaotic in their home, and hopefully that's few and far between. But when that does occur, they can go to the school and they know that it's going to be predictable, it's going to be safe, and I know what to expect. So when things are different, it's good to bring those to light. So sometimes there's activities that we do with schools that we try and understand what are the values at home, and how does respect look like at home versus how does it look at the school. And bringing some of those differences to light can help the educators and the leadership think about, if it's a difference in language, then we might want to shift our language. We might want to adopt some of the language that they're using, that the students are using in the community or at home. If it's the same kind of expectation, it's just a language shift. And maybe just we need to shift and use different language. If it's more than just a language difference, and there's actually some things that are taught that's different or opposite, then we know that, hey, in school, we operate this way. We need to teach it and reinforce it even more. And having that difference brought to light and having that conversation, like, here, just remember, when you come to the school, this is what we expect. And you might have to like teach it double or triple, because we want to make sure that students can really differentiate between contexts and understand, here at this school, this is how we operate. And I think that will serve the students really well as they understand how to navigate different contexts later in life.
And I hear educators use that language quite frequently, actually, when they've identified that there's a difference in expectations between different settings. A student may present and say, but in this particular setting, I'm allowed to, and educators will, but in the school setting, this is the value and expectation. They'll go through and they'll teach and they'll practice that particular value and expectation with the student.
I think that's so important. Just coming back to it, just teachers and the school committee know their students. If there's area that they're struggling with, that they see a lot of like some kind of challenging behavior, that's when it's important to go back, do a reset, and say, hey, look, this is what we expect, and do some quick prompts review of the expectations and practice them more.
It reminds me of a comment that Dr. Russ Fox made in the first podcast episode around, when we see challenging behavior, the answer to it is both overwhelming and underwhelming at the same time, in terms of we assess, we find out what is happening, and we teach to the more appropriate skills. So it's a similar methodology to what you've just described there. When we see a difference in expectations between different settings, we identify which ones are a difference in expectations, and we teach more frequently to the values and expectations within the school setting.
Yeah, smart, very smart.
We're going to shift on this to the second classroom practice, which is looking at routines and procedures. Very briefly, I suppose, how do we define what routines are, and how do they differ from expectations that we've just discussed?
Yeah, so I like it routines to be anything that within that classroom time that you're providing classroom instruction, or even some non-instructional routines, such as arrival, or kind of packing up, are going to and using the bathroom, thinking about how we define that to make the classroom predictable, safe, and efficient. So obviously we want to maximize the learning opportunities that the students have. We want to really making sure that students are getting most out of the teacher's instruction. So routines that happen frequently throughout the day, we want to make sure that the students know exactly what to expect, know exactly what is expected of them. And so it doesn't take as much time to get students ready to learn, or the students benefiting from the instructional process. So routines can be anything from getting started with an activity or teacher-led instruction. It could be a routine around voice volume and understanding the level of volume that's allowed. It could be just a getting attention signal, could be a routine. It could be cooperative group work, could be a routine. I would look at, if I was a teacher, what are the kind of activities, the routines that are happening very frequently in their classroom, and making sure that the expectations are set. So some of those may be like a kind of getting started routine, maybe a step by step set of expectations. Some of them, such as when the teacher's demonstrating and modeling a skill within teaching a lesson, that could be a set of expectations. I expect students to have a voice poem of this, use the attention seeking, the getting attention signal, blah, blah, blah. Or that could be, if you need help, this is how you access help. So sometimes it's a set of expectations, a set of behavioral expectations. Sometimes it's a set of like steps. So making sure that the important thing, however, is that those common routines that students are experiencing every day, that teachers really set that up initially, practice them, and make sure that that's something that they're giving feedback on a regular basis. So maybe start with 3 or 4 and really get those down to be as efficient as possible.
And what is the best way you recommend about teachers going to set up those routines?
Yeah, so just like we did with the expectations, I think it's good to use our explicit instruction process that we do with the academics, making sure that it's clear what those steps are or what the expected behavior is, and identifying those. If it's going to be a common routine, sometimes it's really helpful to have a visual on the wall or you put up on the board, and that really outlines the expectations or steps, and make sure that hopefully you've practiced it at the beginning of the year or term, and that is really just prompting those steps and providing feedback and trying to get those processes as efficient as possible. Again, we're trying to maximize learning. Students spend, again, majority of time in their classrooms. We want to make sure that they're benefiting from your instruction and not just engaging in a transition for a lengthy amount of time. So if we kind of think about that, kind of use our what we do well, which is teaching. So making sure students know what to expect, make sure they have a chance to practice it frequently, and provide that feedback. So regardless of its transition between activities, entering the classroom, think about what the more important routines are that are the problematic routines, and hone in on those and make sure that you kind of practice those and you're providing feedback.
One of the helpful things that I've found when establishing routines as well is listing what the students are doing throughout that routine, but also what the educator is doing throughout that routine to create consistency, particularly when casual staff members or RFF teachers come onto a class, or if it's a school ride routine, then between different educators within the one setting, creating that consistency around what educators are doing throughout that routine as well as students creates that predictable environment that we know produces positive social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes for students.
That's great. I love that. I think it's important that the teacher behaviors are there in a sense of what signals and how we are promoting the behavior we want to see. And that's great. I think of like, if students can see, especially in secondary settings where they're transitioning between classrooms, if students see some commonalities and we're like, okay, I know when the teacher does this, what to expect. But then when a casual comes in, yeah, it makes them so much easier for the casuals. So students benefit from a day with the have with the casual so much more because they're not setting up the lesson and investing too much time in those types of things that are not really learning tasks.
How can educators differentiate between, okay, this routine is embedded, we've done the teaching, we've done the practicing, and it only requires ongoing feedback to maintain that routine, to, okay, this isn't a routine that is quite in place yet. I need to continue to teach, reteach, prompt the steps of this routine until it is embedded. What are some of the things they can look for?
Yeah, just watch your students. So I think at a general basis, it's good regularly just to review the routines, just to make sure that we're spending more time in prevention. However, if you find that your students their behavior and they're not transitioning well between activities efficiently as you would like, or as it has been when you initially taught it, or you find that there's certain areas that are not as smooth, or there's a little more problematic behavior that is predictable at what seems like every time we come back from lunch, we're having these challenges, that is when it's important to think about, okay, instead of just responding and reacting all the time, maybe I can do a little bit more prevention and I can invest in reteaching, reviewing, do a little bit more prompts to make sure that we're investing in making sure that all students know for that particular time of day what to expect of them and what to look for as the teacher to prompt those behaviors and then those kind of learning behaviors, I should say. And then make sure you think about like reinforcing that routine a little bit more than you would have in the past. And then once you see that routine get more efficient, solid, the students and the teachers' behaviors, everything's in concert and doing really well, that's when you could start the fade. I wouldn't say fade out, but fade down and maybe minimize the amount of reteaching and prompting. And that allows so much more time for the instruction. But initially, we might need to increase the amount of micro teaching, prompts, review, just to make sure we get those routines solid. And so once they're up and running and the students really know what to expect, and yes, definitely fade down those prompts and fade down you may even reduce a little bit of the reinforcement on that and move your reinforcement onto some other behavior that you're looking to really increase or skill you're looking to increase in your students. But you'll always be monitoring your students' behavior to know where you need to focus your teaching around those routines.
I like that concept of fade down as opposed to fade out, because we'll always require some level of prompting, some level of reminding, some level of feedback to maintain those routines. However, the frequency of it can reduce once those routines become more habitual, I suppose.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that's we always have to practice at some level, whether it's once a year or daily.
We've touched on reinforcement a number of times, and it gives us a nice little segue into the positive classroom practice number 3, which is behavior-specific feedback. Jennifer Payne touched on it in our last podcast as well when we we're talking about acknowledgement systems and increasing the likelihood that students will engage in appropriate behaviors again in the future, that concept of reinforcement. What makes behavior-specific feedback effective?
So when we think about behavioral specific feedback, again, it's an important part of the explicit instruction process. Students need to know when they did it correctly versus when they made an error. We do this all the time with our academic skills. We give feedback on academic assignments. We say, if a student got an answer correctly, we let them know. We want to do that with social emotional behavior as well. So with that, we want to be very clear on what we're providing that feedback on. So there's really 3 components we look for behavioral specific feedback. One is making sure the student use the student's name, or like you call out if it's a whole class, you let the whole class know that as a whole class, they're being recognized, what they're being recognized for, that student or class. Like what is the expected behavior or the skill that they did that was why you're giving that feedback. And then you want to have the positive praise statement. So that could be looking like, hey, Jake, thanks for getting started straight away. That was awesome. I could look as simple as that. We're looking for those 3 components. The problem with general praise is that, yes, it's not, I wouldn't say don't do it. I just say we want to have much more behavioral specific feedback if we can. So it's very clear what students did correctly and what you want to see more of. And that will really help with not only reinforcing that behavior and hopefully seeing more of that, but it's also teaching the expectations. It gives an opportunity for you to go do another kind of quick touch on of what you expect, and in a way, a reteach of that expected behavior, that skill. It gives clarity to all the students that are in that classroom of what you expect and what you want to see more of. And that's that great because it's really provides much more attention to desired behaviors versus when we lean on our corrective techniques, which can draw attention to the negative or the behaviors you don't want to see and really change the whole feel of the environment of that classroom to less of a positive one. So the more that we can focus on those positive specific, behavioral specific feedback statements, the more our classroom climate is going to be much more one that is supportive and where students want to be.
It's a great redirection strategy too. We see educators, when we're lucky enough to go into classrooms, do this beautifully in terms of that pivot praise strategy where there may be a student engaging in inappropriate behavior. They identify the student who's engaging in the more appropriate replacement behavior, and they catch that and provide feedback on that in order to correct the inappropriate behavior in the classroom.
Yeah.
Because when we're using behavior specific feedback, this is particularly common around after playtimes where there may be a short assembly and they highlight some of the things that some students have done really well within play, which is a great strategy and it's great, a way to be positive before moving into the classroom. When we look at the timing of that behavior specific feedback, is that an important consideration to make? And if so, what are the recommendations around the timing? And if there are any other recommendations around how to deliver behavior specific feedback effectively?
I mean, if you could be as immediate as possible, the better off you are. And I know that the kind of instructional routine or kind of transitions don't always allow for immediate specific praise, but the closer we can be to when it actually occurred, the better off it is, because it's fresh. The student knows exactly what they did. It draws a direct connection. So the more immediate you can be, the better. But just again, it needs to be genuine. It needs to be natural. So within that, you just need to go with the environment and what's going on. And if it's just not a good time to provide praise at that point or that feedback, if it's delayed a little bit, that'll be okay. But hopefully, the majority of the opportunities allow you quick and immediate feedback or praise. The other kind of things to really think about is when we're teaching new skills, we want probably a lot more praise because it's new. Students are really trying out a skill. And as they're trying something out, we need to really that clear feedback that, yep, that's right. That's what you're doing is great. Keep it up. That's wonderful. So getting that validation that what you're doing, you're on the right track, especially when you're trying new things, is just so helpful. So think about maximizing it, especially with newer skills or newer routines. And that's something to think about. And then we're all different humans and we all praise and interact with each other differently. So try and make it genuine. What does that look like for you to praise? Initially, if it's just not something you're used to, just start doing it. And it may not be authentic initially, but hopefully as you try it out in different ways, just like with any skill that you're trying to shape with your students, we're shaping it in ourselves. Yeah, just try your best to figure out like ways to do it authentically and genuinely. So those are some other key things to think about, is really making sure that it's as immediate as possible, as close to the timing that the skill or the behavior occurred, as well as making sure that we are a little bit more, our dosage is a little bit higher for newer skills and skills that we really are shaping up, as well as being genuine. Those are the three things that I would really think about.
This classroom practice is similar to the other two in a lot of ways in terms of teachers are doing these things. The tricky part about these practices is to ensure that we're doing them at the right amount of frequency or the right dosage level in order to improve student outcomes. What are your recommendations around how often this sort of practice should be occurring?
So there's research out there that you want to be much more positive than corrective. And we think about environments that we want to be in. We want to be in environments where people are saying lovely things, saying nice things, that we feel validated and affirmed, versus going in an environment where much of their kind of interactions are negative and corrective. So if an environment is like much more corrective than positive, it's not going to be a happy place to be or a place you want to be. So overall, we want to be much more on the positive side. And remember, we're teaching skills. We're talking about things we want to see students do more. So hopefully it's a good thing to be positive. We all look at it that way. With that, there is a little bit of research out there that really talks about being 5 times more positive than corrective. And I think that's something that it's really nice to have some kind of research that supports this. However, for the average teacher, I think the thing to think about is really trying to build towards that. And I can think if this is something that is natural to you and you do all the time, and in many of our contexts, it might not be hard to achieve. I've been in many classrooms that teachers are very positive and are really quick and able to authentically deliver a bunch of praise to their students efficiently and hit those five praise statements to corrections. And other classrooms, there's a lot of challenging behavior. And so it may be harder to do so. So again, this is when we need to go back and review all of our classroom practices and think about, okay, do we need to stop, pause, and reset and reteach and reprompt, but then make sure that we are being heavy with that praise when that occurs. So again, think about being 4 or 5 times much more positive than giving a correction. And I should probably explain really quickly what a correction is any time that a student has a behavioral error or a challenging behavior, and we have to go and redirect that or correct that behavior. Anytime that that happens, we want to be 4 or 5 times more positive. And when you think about that, hopefully it makes sense on the level of like we learn through what we should do versus telling somebody what they should not do. When we're told what we should not do, it's clear what we shouldn't do, but it may not be clear what we should be doing instead. So that's why we want to be 4 or 5 times more positive on what we want the behavior to be, whether it's with that student or with their peers in the classroom. They can see the positive examples. Oh, I should be doing that instead. So that's where that positive specific feedback is really important because it really provides in that situation a positive example of what to do or how to meet the expectations or how to be a really strong learner. So that really helps the student really understand and shift towards internalizing and really building their own kind of understanding of what's best to do within the learning environment. So hopefully that praise is 4 or 5 positives to a correction. And then hopefully as the classroom climate improves and the classroom is really so much positive behavior and the expected behavior is pretty routine, then you're probably not delivering many corrections. And if you're not delivering many corrections, hitting those 5 positives to one correction is really easy. So again, try and know what a good goal is, but personally look at the number of praise statements or positive feedback statements you're making to corrections. And if it's a ratio that you're much more corrective than positive, try and get initially to a 1-to-1 ratio. And then over time, increase it. So start where you're at, try and increase it by a bit and keep making hopefully successive changes and hopefully becomes more authentic, more natural. The classroom environment starts to shift and makes it easier. And then you can start ramping up to the much more positives, like the 5 praise statements to corrective.
And we can probably all relate to that particular relationship where, whether it being an old boss or an old teacher or someone in your life where you're constantly being corrected by the one person, that relationship can become very aversive very quickly. It's here this person comes again. But you are right as well. There are some classroom environments where you look and you spend some time in the room, you're like, man, this would be very tricky to get a high praise to correction ratio within this classroom. And then going back, stripping it back to those other classroom practices and looking at where we can create small wins so we can catch those behaviors and reinforce them over time to increase the likelihood that they can happen again, to embed those routines and expectations within the setting is so important.
Yeah, that menu of classroom practices is there for the teachers to maximize their instruction. So understanding those, and that's where, like as I talked to you before, the science and the art of teaching come together. We want to make sure all teachers know the science so then they can make and use their judgment to maximize them as they need to really make sure that all students are benefiting and feel safe in their classroom.
Just quickly, as we begin to round out this conversation on positive classroom practices, we've spoken about the positive classroom practices as producing a lot of positive outcomes for academic, social, and behavioral outcomes for students. What are the benefits of utilizing and having these practices embedded within the classroom as it pertains to mental health outcomes for students?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's good. Sometimes we've been talking a lot today about social emotional behavior, but when we think about this, students that when it comes to having a traumatic event in someone's life, having a safe place to go to is so important. So the more that we could really make sure that our classrooms are places where It's positive, it's predictable. The students really know what to expect, really brings out a strong sense of that well-being, and really supports the mental health needs in a sense of it's not going to be a chaotic environment. It's a classroom that I can go to. I have a trusted adult. Really kind of helps ensure those solid routines, those consistent, predictable environments really help build, especially when you get a lot of positive feedback, that you can feel valued, important, and feel good about yourself is really going to help and support students to feel safe, help them regulate on a daily basis, and really have a sense of belonging. Those are all things that really support well-being and the mental health of our students. We want them to be those positive places that students who have had some kind of adversity or trauma really have a place that they can go. And they know that between the students, the school community, it's they know what to expect. They feel safe. They know they're going to be acknowledged and feel supported. And that really benefits everybody, including the educators. They want to be that person for those students. So knowing what strategies really help maximize that is really important.
There are some phenomenal ways that schools have embedded social and emotional learning within the teaching of their expectations and routines within the classroom as well. I've seen particular classrooms or schools have in their routine matrix around if a student is upset or feeling frustrated, certain strategies that they can rely on certain routines they can fall back on in order to improve self-regulation.
I think that's the thing about it, is like when it comes to the process of providing instruction, you know, and we're interacting with students on a daily basis, making sure those routines are ones that are a positive one, and that students are, as they show up every day, that those interactions are one that they are supportive, they're affirmed, they have an adult that they can go to if they need additional support, but also they know that they're not going to be judged, and it's going to be a place where they can bring up concerns, and they know that the adult's going to listen. And I think that's really important. That's why we didn't really get to touch on positive relationships, but the much more that teachers know their students outside of school as well as inside of school, and know what their interests are and what's important to them, is really going to help build that school connection that's going to have effects on the learning process as well, in a very positive way. If you know your teacher knows you, understands you, when it comes to that lesson, you're going to be much more likely to engage and participate.
And Adam, as we round out today's conversation on positive classroom practices, we have only been able to touch on sort of 3 of the high leverage classroom practices that you recommend we speak about. Where can educators or school leaders go to find out more about the other classroom practices? Are there any resources that you recommend in particular? I know you've touched on the supporting and responding document, as well as the Victoria Department of Education Positive Classroom Management Strategies placemats. Are there any other resources that you recommend?
I think most of the different jurisdictions will have clear guidance on what to expect in classrooms. And I've seen across Australia, they have listed really a good number of the standard classroom practices. So whether you're part of the independent school group, go to your association of independent schools and talk with them. And if you're in a Catholic and a part of a diocese, talk to any leadership around social emotional behavior and well-being. And I'm sure they can help guide you. But clearly, I would keep going back to those, either that Victoria Department of Ed Positive Classroom Management Strategies is a great free resource out there. You can download those and use those for your professional learning activities or PLCs, as well as that, like you mentioned, the supporting responding document is really helpful as well. So I think that would be my go-to. As always, they can always reach out to us at Sub Collective, and we're happy to provide support as well.
Which leads into my next question. Where can the listeners reach out to you if they want to contact you or learn more about the work that you are doing?
Yeah, if they want, they can reach out to me directly via my email at adam@Seb Collective. That's SEB as in social emotional behavior, Seb Collective, all one word, .com.au. Or you can go to the website, which is www.sebcollective.com.au.
Adam, thank you so much for your time today to delve into those positive classroom practices. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on to share your knowledge, and I appreciate you sharing your time as well, because I know you get pulled pillar to post in terms of the different work that schools and organisations want you to engage in. So we're very lucky to have you here in New South Wales, and particularly along the South Coast and in the Sydney area, to provide that support to local schools. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jake. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate you putting this podcast together and really sharing these important practices with the larger Australian community. This is very important, so thank you.